Before the sun reached the horizon, the detention center already felt awake. The fluorescent lights hummed above narrow hallways that smelled of old concrete, disinfectant, and sleepless nights. Outside, rain tapped softly against the reinforced windows, turning the morning into a blur of gray shadows. Some people believed prison was loud. Most mornings, it was painfully quiet. That silence was where regrets learned to speak. Rowan Mercer sat on the edge of his bunk, his elbows resting on his knees. His orange uniform hung loosely from his thin frame, and a fading bruise colored the side of his jaw. He stared toward the tiny window, though it showed little more than a patch of cloudy sky. He often wondered which mistake had truly brought him there. Was it the first wallet he stole when he was 16? The first lie? The first night he decided hunger mattered more than honesty? Or had everything begun much earlier, inside a small apartment where fear always arrived before his father did? His earliest memories were not of birthdays or holidays. They were of whispered arguments behind thin walls. His mother tried to make every empty meal feel like a celebration. She smiled even when there was almost nothing left to cook. She could turn a piece of toast into hope with only a few gentle words. When she became sick, the apartment grew colder. After she passed away, it became unbearably silent. His father filled that silence with anger instead of love. By 17, Rowan understood something no teenager should ever have to learn. Sometimes home was the most dangerous place in the world. Leaving should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like falling. He slept in abandoned buildings, cheap shelters, and train stations. Every morning became another question of survival. Every evening became another calculation of what he could endure before giving up. The first time he stole food, he cried before opening the package. The 10th time, he barely noticed. Life had a cruel way of teaching people which parts of themselves they could afford to lose. Years passed. Small thefts became larger ones. Not because Rowan enjoyed crime. The burglary crew welcomed him without asking difficult questions. They called themselves a family. Looking back, Rowan realized families were not supposed to disappear the moment something went wrong. An expensive house. Owners away for the weekend. 10 quiet minutes. Enough money for everyone to disappear and start over. That was the promise. Promises, Rowan would later discover, were the easiest things to steal. The alarm sounded only minutes after they entered. Someone had tipped off the police. Sirens filled the neighborhood. Blue and red lights painted every window. Panic spread through the house. One by one, the crew scattered toward different exits. Then Mason fell. His ankle twisted as he jumped down a staircase. "I can't run," Mason whispered, his voice shaking. The others never looked back. One of them shouted that Rowan should leave him behind. Rowan looked toward the open back door. Freedom waited only a few steps away. Then he looked back at Mason. Some choice, he stayed. Within seconds, officers entered the house. Neither of them resisted. The handcuffs felt colder than Rowan expected. He remembered wondering if betrayal always felt that cold. 3 weeks later, detention had settled into routine. Wake up. Count. Meals. Silence. More silence. Most correctional officers treated every inmate exactly the same. Keep your head down. Follow instructions. Do not ask questions. Do not expect kindness. Rowan expected nothing else. Then Officer Gavin Brooks appeared. He wasn't loud. He wasn't intimidating. He rarely raised his voice. Instead, he carried himself with a calm that made everyone around him lower theirs. The other officers laughed during breaks. Gavin usually read books. He spoke politely. Never more words than necessary. Never fewer than respect required. Rowan decided almost immediately that he didn't trust him. People who looked calm often hid storms better than anyone else. One unusually cold evening, the heating system malfunctioned inside one housing unit. The temperature dropped quickly. The inmates complained. Nothing changed. Rowan wrapped his arms around himself and leaned against the wall, pretending the cold didn't bother him. Several minutes later, footsteps stopped outside his cell. Officer Brooks stood there holding a folded blanket. "You'll need this tonight," he said quietly. Rowan frowned. Why? It's cold. That's not really an answer. Gavin offered the blanket through the opening without another word. Rowan hesitated. People rarely gave something without expecting something in return. What do you want? Rowan asked. Nothing. No one does anything for nothing. For the first time, Gavin looked directly into his eyes. Maybe someone should. Their eyes remained locked for only a second. Yet somehow that second lingered longer than entire conversations Rowan had shared with other people. He accepted the blanket without speaking. Gavin nodded once before continuing down the hallway. Rowan watched him disappear around the corner. The blanket was ordinary, gray, worn, slightly rough around the edges. Yet it carried unexpected warmth. Not because of the fabric. Because someone had noticed he was cold. That night, Rowan couldn't sleep. Rain continued tapping softly against the narrow window. The prison remained wrapped in darkness. He replayed the conversation again and again. He had spent years believing kindness always carried a hidden price. Officer Brooks had asked for nothing. That unsettled him more than cruelty ever could. Lying awake beneath the blanket, Rowan closed his eyes and tried to convince himself it meant nothing. But somewhere deep inside a heart he thought had become impossible to reach, a tiny crack appeared. It frightened him more than the prison walls ever had. Because for the first time in years, someone had looked at him as though he was still a person worth seeing. The days inside the detention center rarely changed. Morning counts blended into afternoon routines, and evenings disappeared beneath the same pale lights that never seemed to grow warmer. Time moved differently behind concrete walls. It stretched when hope was missing and vanished whenever memories became too painful to hold. Rowan Mercer had learned to survive by expecting nothing. Yet every now and then, Officer Gavin Brooks quietly disrupted that expectation. It never happened in dramatic ways. Sometimes Gavin simply greeted him by name instead of by his inmate number. Sometimes he reminded another officer that respect cost nothing. Sometimes he left a few extra minutes at the library before escorting Rowan back to his housing unit. Each gesture was small. Together, they became impossible to ignore. Rowan told himself the kindness meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. People who expected kindness usually ended up disappointed. One rainy afternoon, Rowan was assigned to organize damaged books in the prison library. The room felt strangely peaceful compared to the rest of the facility. Dust floated through narrow beams of light, and shelves stretched across quiet corners filled with stories written by people who had escaped reality using only words. Gavin stood near the doorway, completing paperwork. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Rowan picked up an old novel with a torn cover. "I used to think books were only for people with easy lives," he said without looking up. Gavin glanced toward him. "And now?" Rowan traced a finger across the faded pages. "Now, I think they're for people trying to survive difficult ones." A faint smile appeared on Gavin's face. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "I think you're right." The conversation ended there. Oddly, neither of them felt the need to say more. Over the following weeks, the library became Rowan's favorite assignment. Officially, he repaired damaged books. Unofficially, it gave him a chance to breathe. Sometimes Gavin recommended novels without saying they were recommendations. A worn mystery book would appear on a shelf Rowan happened to organize. A story about forgiveness would quietly replace another title. Neither acknowledged the silent exchange. Neither needed to. The book spoke for them. One afternoon Rowan discovered a handwritten note tucked inside an old paperback. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Simply read, "The hardest prison isn't always built with walls." The handwriting belonged to Gavin. Rowan folded the note carefully before returning it exactly where he had found it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he smiled all the way back to his cell. Gavin carried burdens Rowan knew nothing about. Every evening, after finishing his shift, Gavin drove home to a small house that felt larger than it should. The photographs remained exactly where they had been for years. He never moved them. One picture always caught his attention. Two young men stood beside a quiet lake, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them was Gavin. The other was Noah. Years earlier, They had dreamed about building a life together. Instead, Gavin buried himself in work. He convinced himself there would always be more time. There wasn't. Noah accepted a job across the country. Neither fought hard enough to stay. The distance became permanent. Since then, Gavin had learned an unfortunate lesson. Sometimes losing someone happened quietly, not through arguments, not through betrayal, simply because fear convinced both people to remain silent. That silence still followed him. Perhaps that was why Rowan unsettled him. Behind the young man's guarded expression, Gavin recognized the loneliness he had once hidden inside himself. It worried him. Professional boundaries existed for good reasons. He reminded himself of that every day. Some reminders were easier to believe than others. Word traveled quickly inside detention. Inmates noticed everything, especially kindness. "Looks like Brooks has a favorite," one inmate muttered during dinner. Another laughed. "Maybe good behavior finally pays." The comments were harmless on the surface. Still, Rowan felt his face grow warm. He hated that they noticed. More importantly, he hated that part of him didn't mind. The rumors reached Gavin before the week ended. An older correctional officer leaned beside him during break. "You should be careful." "I am." "The inmates are talking. They usually are. This one's different." Gavin looked through the break room window toward the prison yard. "I know." That evening he made a difficult decision. He asked another officer to supervise the library program temporarily. The request was approved without question. Rowan waited in the library the following afternoon, more withdrawn. The change sat heavily on Gavin's conscience. Creating distance had been the responsible choice. It should have brought peace. Instead, it made every hallway feel longer. Every shift felt heavier. Every silence grew louder. Neither man realized they were protecting the other. Neither understood that the distance was hurting them both. Some connections did not begin with grand declarations. They began with shared silence. A borrowed book. A blanket on a cold night. A name spoken with kindness. And sometimes those smallest moments became the hardest ones to forget. As Rowan returned to his cell that evening, he caught a brief glimpse of Gavin at the far end of the corridor. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. Gavin offered the smallest nod before continuing his rounds. It should have meant nothing. For his own heart had quietly built walls of its own, and he had no idea how to escape them. The seasons changed outside the prison walls. Inside, nothing seemed to change at all. The same doors opened and closed with heavy echoes. The same footsteps crossed the concrete floors. The same clocks counted endless hours that felt longer than entire years. Yet Rowan Mercer knew something had changed. He no longer measured his days by meals or head counts. He measured them by the rare moments he caught sight of Officer Gavin Brooks. Sometimes it was only a passing glance in a hallway. Sometimes Gavin paused just long enough to ask, "Everything all right?" Rowan always answered the same way, "I'm fine." Neither of them believed it. One gray afternoon, Rowan was called into the visitation room. He expected no visitors. No family remained. No friends had written. When he entered, he found only his court-appointed attorney. The older man looked unusually serious. "There have been rumors," he said quietly. "What kind of rumors?" "People from your old crew believe someone informed the police before the robbery." Rowan frowned. "I didn't." "I know." "They think it was me?" The attorney nodded. "They're convinced." A cold feeling settled deep inside Rowan's chest. Among thieves, being labeled an informant carried consequences that often lasted far beyond prison. "I never betrayed anyone. The truth doesn't always matter." Those words stayed with Rowan long after the meeting ended. Over the following week, strange things began happening. Conversations stopped whenever Rowan entered the recreation yard. Whispers followed him through crowded hallways. One inmate deliberately bumped his shoulder before muttering, "Traitors don't last long." Rowan kept walking. He refused to respond. Inside, however, old fears returned. Fear had once ruled every decision he made. He had promised himself never to live that way again. Now it stood patiently outside his door, waiting to be invited back. Gavin noticed the changes almost immediately. Years of experience had taught him that violence usually announced itself quietly before it arrived loudly. He watched inmates exchanging subtle glances. He noticed Rowan eating alone. He saw tension settling over every movement the young man made. One evening, Gavin reviewed several incident reports. A particular inmate's name appeared repeatedly. Travis Cole. Repeated fights. Known connections to organized burglary groups. Recently receiving unusually frequent visitors. None of it proved anything. Together, it formed a picture Gavin didn't like. He quietly informed his supervisor that increased monitoring would be wise. The recommendation received little attention. "There isn't enough evidence," the supervisor replied. Gavin nodded. But something deep inside him refused to let the concern disappear. 3 days later, the prison gym hosted its scheduled recreation period. The room echoed with bouncing basketballs and casual conversation. Rowan remained near the far wall, reading one of the novels borrowed from the library. He barely noticed Travis approaching. "You've got nerve," Travis said. Rowan looked up. "I don't want trouble. You already caused it. I never talked." "Liar." Before Rowan could answer, Travis shoved him backward. The book fell to the floor. Several inmates stepped away. No one wanted to become involved. Rowan raised his hands. "I'm not fighting." "You don't get a choice." Travis swung first. The punch struck Rowan across the cheek. Another inmate moved behind Rowan, blocking his path. For one terrifying second, Rowan understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a fight. It was punishment. "Enough." Gavin's voice cut across the gym like thunder. Several officers rushed inside. Travis attempted another punch. Gavin stepped between them without hesitation. "Stand down. Now." The room fell silent. Travis glared at Rowan before officers escorted him away. Rowan remained standing for only a moment. Then his knees weakened. Gavin caught him before he struck the floor. "You okay?" Gavin asked quietly. Rowan tried to smile. "I've had worse." Blood trickled from a split lip. A bruise was already forming beneath one eye. Gavin's expression remained calm. Only his eyes betrayed the fear he refused to show. The prison nurse cleaned Rowan's injuries. Nothing was broken. Mostly bruises. Mostly. As Rowan prepared to leave the medical room, Gavin stood waiting outside. "You should report every threat. They won't stop." "I can still try to help." Rowan looked down at the floor. "People who care usually leave." Gavin answered almost immediately. "I'm still here." The words were simple. Yet neither of them seemed prepared for how deeply they landed. For a brief moment, the hallway disappeared. There was only silence. And two people carrying more loneliness than either knew how to explain. That evening, another correctional officer approached Gavin. "I heard what happened." Gavin remained silent. "You stepped between them." "I followed procedure." The officer sighed. "Be careful." "I always am." "No." The older man lowered his voice. "You care." Gavin looked through the security window toward the dark hallway beyond. "I care about every inmate's safety." "That's not what I meant." Neither spoke again. Some truths became louder when left unspoken. A week later, Gavin made another difficult decision. He requested reassignment away from Rowan's housing unit. Officially, he cited professional boundaries after the recent incident. Unofficially, he feared his growing concern might eventually harm Rowan instead of protecting him. The transfer happened quickly. Too quickly. Rowan noticed before anyone explained. Another officer conducted morning rounds. Another officer supervised library duty. Another officer walked the evening corridors. Gavin was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Only absence. The emptiness hurt far more than Rowan wanted to admit. He stopped borrowing books. Stopped joining library assignments. Stopped looking toward every opening door. The walls felt heavier again. He wondered if everyone eventually proved the same. Kindness arrived. Hope followed. Then both quietly disappeared. Days later, Rowan received unexpected news. His attorney returned carrying new evidence. Investigators had uncovered phone records connected to the robbery months earlier. The anonymous tip had not come from Rowan. It came from Derek Sullivan, the man Rowan had trusted more than anyone else inside the burglary crew. The man who had convinced everyone they were family. Derek had secretly negotiated a reduced sentence for himself before the robbery even began. He had sacrificed everyone else, including Rowan. The truth landed harder than any punch ever could. Rowan stared silently at the table. His chest tightened. He had spent weeks believing strangers hated him. Now he realized someone he once called a brother had quietly sold his future. The betrayal reached deeper than prison walls. It reached into every memory he thought had once been real. That night Rowan lay awake beneath the same gray blanket Gavin had given him months earlier. He touched its rough fabric with trembling fingers. Outside, rain tapped gently against the narrow window. Inside, the silence felt endless. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness. "I wish you hadn't walked away." He didn't know whether he was speaking to the life he had lost, or to the man whose quiet kindness had become the safest place his heart had ever known. Spring arrived quietly. From the narrow prison windows, Rowan Mercer could only see pieces of it. Patch of blue sky, fresh leaves trembling in the morning breeze, birds landing briefly on the outer fence before flying toward a freedom they never questioned. For the first time in years, Rowan allowed himself to imagine life beyond the walls. Not because prison had become easier, because hope had returned in the smallest, most unexpected way. His attorney arrived one Monday carrying more than legal documents. He carried good news. "The investigation is finished," he said, sitting across from Rowan. The court reviewed the new evidence. Derek Sullivan's confession, financial records, and witness statements changed everything. Rowan remained silent. He had learned that hope could disappear as quickly as it appeared. "What does that mean?" "It means your cooperation helped expose corruption connected to the burglary ring. Your sentence has been reduced." Rowan stared at him. "Reduced?" "You'll be released next week." The words felt unreal. For months he had dreamed about hearing them. Now that they had finally arrived, they frightened him. Freedom sounded beautiful, until he remembered he had nowhere to go. Release day came beneath a bright morning sky. The heavy security gate opened with its familiar metallic groan. Rowan stepped outside carrying everything he owned inside one small canvas bag. A few folded clothes, several worn paperbacks from the prison library, given to him with permission. One gray blanket that the prison allowed him to keep because it had been marked for disposal. He held it carefully. It reminded him that kindness could exist even in places built from concrete. The parking lot stood almost empty. No family waited. No friends. No welcoming embrace. Only quiet wind moving through the trees. Rowan took one uncertain step forward. For the first time in years, he had no idea where he belonged. The following months were not easy. Finding work proved difficult. Most employers noticed his criminal record before they noticed his determination. Several interviews ended politely. Others ended before they truly began. Eventually, a small independent bookstore took a chance on him. Its elderly owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, believed people deserved opportunities instead of permanent labels. "If books can have second editions," she often joked, "people deserve second chances." The bookstore became Rowan's refuge. He repaired damaged covers, organized forgotten novels, recommended stories to lonely customers who wandered through the aisles looking for comfort without realizing it. For the first time since childhood, life felt peaceful. Still, every evening one thought returned. He wondered how Officer Gavin Brooks was doing. Then he reminded himself that prison belonged to the past. So did Gavin. Or at least that was what he tried to believe. Unknown to Rowan, Gavin's life had changed as well. The investigation inside the detention center uncovered misconduct involving several employees and outside criminal connections. Although Gavin had done nothing wrong, the experience changed him. He realized he had spent years enforcing rules while quietly ignoring his own heart. After careful reflection, he resigned. Not out of bitterness. Out of honesty. He accepted a position with a community organization helping former inmates rebuild their lives. The work felt different. More personal. More hopeful. Yet one face continued appearing in his thoughts. A young man who loved books more than he admitted. A young man whose guarded smile had somehow remained with Gavin long after the prison gates closed behind him. Nearly 6 months passed. One rainy afternoon, Gavin stepped into a neighborhood bookstore, hoping to escape the weather for a few minutes. The familiar scent of old paper surrounded him. Soft music played somewhere near the front counter. He wandered slowly through the shelves. Then he heard a voice. "Can I help you find something?" Gavin turned. Time seemed to stop. Rowan stood only a few feet away. Neither man spoke. Rain tapped gently against the front windows. Customers continued browsing, unaware that 2 lives had unexpectedly crossed paths once again. Rowan finally smiled. A small smile. The kind that appeared before tears. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Gavin answered just as quietly. "I've thought about this moment more times than I'd admit." Mrs. Hayes politely disappeared into the back office, sensing the conversation needed privacy. They sat near the reading corner, surrounded by shelves that stretched almost to the ceiling. For several moments, neither knew where to begin. Finally, Rowan laughed softly. "I imagined this conversation 100 different ways. And none of them started with silence." Gavin smiled. "I've always been better at listening." The familiar calm in his voice made Rowan feel unexpectedly safe. Then the questions arrived. "Why did you disappear?" The words escaped before Rowan could stop them. Gavin lowered his eyes. "I thought leaving was the safest choice." "For who?" "For both of us. You never even said goodbye." "I wanted to." "What stopped you?" "My fear." The answer carried no excuses, only truth. "I was responsible for protecting you," Gavin continued quietly. "I was afraid that if I stayed too close, people would question every decision I made. I didn't want my feelings to place your future at risk." Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "You cared." "I did." "You still do." Gavin met his eyes. "I never stopped." Emotion settled gently between them. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Simply honest. Rowan looked toward the rain-covered window. "I used to think everyone eventually walked away." "I know. I almost convinced myself you had forgotten me. I tried." Rowan blinked. "Tried?" Gavin nodded. "I failed." A quiet laugh escaped both of them. The tension that had lived between them for months slowly dissolved. "I kept one of the books," Rowan admitted. "The one about second chances." Gavin smiled. "I wondered." "And?" Rowan's voice softened. "I kept the blanket too. For reasons neither could explain." Those words carried more emotion than any declaration ever could. As evening settled outside, the bookstore lights glowed warmly against the rain. Neither man noticed how much time had passed. Finally, Rowan stood. So, we've both spent enough time running from difficult conversations." Gavin nodded. "I agree." Rowan took one careful step closer. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like." "Neither do I. But I know one thing." Gavin waited. Rowan smiled with quiet certainty. "I don't want to keep wondering what might have happened if we had been brave." For the first time, Gavin reached out without hesitation. His hand found Rowan's. Their fingers intertwined naturally. No audience. No applause. Only 2 hearts choosing honesty after months of silence. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Above the bookstore, the clouds slowly parted, allowing warm evening sunlight to shine through. Felt less like the end of a difficult journey, and more like the beginning of a life neither of them had ever believed they deserved. A year passed more gently than either Rowan Mercer or Gavin Brooks had imagined. Life did not suddenly become perfect. The past still followed them in quiet moments. Some mornings Rowan woke from dreams of prison doors closing behind him. On other nights, Gavin questioned whether he had done enough for the people he had once been responsible for protecting. Healing, they discovered, was never a straight path. It was a series of small choices made every day. And each morning they chose to keep walking together. The little bookstore became more than Rowan's workplace. It became his home. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes eventually retired, leaving the shop in Rowan's care. She insisted it wasn't charity. "It's an investment," she told him with a warm smile. "I've spent my whole life watching people. You're one of the few who truly understands what stories can do." Rowan accepted with tears in his eyes. For years, people had judged him by his worst mistake. Mrs. Hayes saw him for his best qualities instead. The sign above the entrance remained the same. But inside, something had changed. Every visitor was welcomed with warmth. There was free coffee in one corner, comfortable chairs beside the windows, a shelf labeled Second Chances, filled with novels about hope, forgiveness, and resilience. It quickly became the most popular section in the store. Gavin found purpose in his new career. He worked with a nonprofit organization that helped former inmates rebuild their lives after release. He assisted with job applications, housing referrals, counseling appointments. Sometimes all a person needed was someone willing to say, "I believe you can begin again." Gavin never forgot how powerful those words could be. Whenever someone asked why he cared so deeply, he simply smiled. Because someone is more than the worst chapter of their life. On weekends, Rowan often joined him. Together they visited community centers and spoke with young adults who felt trapped by poverty, loneliness, or the influence of criminal groups. Rowan never hid his past. "I made terrible choices," he would tell them honestly. "But I wasn't born wanting to hurt people." The room always became quiet. "I believed crime was the only door left open." He would glance toward Gavin before continuing. "Someone finally showed me another door." His story never promised easy endings. Promised something more realistic. Change. One crisp autumn morning, Rowan suggested taking a drive. Gavin noticed the small bouquet of white lilies resting on the passenger seat. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "My mother." Neither spoke for the rest of the journey. Some silences deserved respect. The cemetery rested on a peaceful hillside overlooking rows of tall oak trees. Leaves drifted gently across the grass. The wind carried the scent of fresh earth and distant rain. Rowan knelt before a simple headstone. He carefully placed the flowers beside it. For a long while he said nothing. Gavin remained several steps behind, giving him space. Finally Rowan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent years believing I had disappointed you." His eyes filled with tears. "I thought there was no coming back after everything I had done." A tear slipped down his cheek. "But I kept trying." He smiled through the emotion. "I found people who reminded me what kindness looks like." His gaze shifted toward Gavin. "And I found someone who saw me when I couldn't even see myself." The wind stirred softly around them. "I hope, wherever you are, you know your son finally found his way home." When Rowan stood, Gavin quietly reached for his hand. Neither needed more words. Some love was best expressed through presence. That evening they walked beside a quiet lake, where the water reflected the orange colors of the setting sun. It reminded Gavin of another life, another relationship, another version of himself who had been too afraid to speak. "I used to believe regret stayed forever," Gavin admitted. Rowan looked at him. "Do you still believe that?" Gavin shook his head. "No." "What changed?" "You." Rowan laughed softly. "I didn't erase your regrets." "No." Gavin smiled. "You taught me they don't have to decide the future." They stopped walking. The lake shimmered beneath the fading light. "I've been thinking about something," Gavin said. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" "Hopefully not." Gavin reached into his coat pocket. Instead of a ring, he removed a small silver key attached to a leather keychain. Rowan looked confused. Gavin smiled. "I found a little house near the edge of town." "A house?" "It's nothing fancy." He laughed quietly. "The roof probably needs work, The garden definitely needs work. But he placed the key gently into Rowan's hand. I don't want it to become my home. He paused. I want it to become ours. Rowan stared at the tiny key resting in his palm. Something so small, yet somehow heavier than every burden he had carried for years. His eyes filled once again. I've never really had a home. I know. I don't even know how. We'll learn together. Without another word, Rowan wrapped his arms around Gavin. The embrace was steady, safe, unhurried. Like two people finally allowing themselves to stop surviving and simply live. Several months later, the bookstore hosted its annual winter reading night. The chairs were full. Children listened to stories. Older couples shared quiet smiles over warm drinks. Teenagers browsed shelves that might quietly change their lives. Near the entrance stood a small wooden sign. Everyone deserves another chapter. Mrs. Hayes noticed it and smiled proudly. You wrote that? Rowan nodded. I had some help. Across the room, Gavin looked up from helping a young visitor choose a novel. Their eyes met. The same quiet understanding passed between them that had once begun inside a prison library. Only now there were no walls between them, no locked doors, no fear of tomorrow, only trust, only hope, only love that had been built patiently, honestly, and gently, one small act of kindness at a time. As snow began falling outside, Rowan slipped his hand into Gavin's. He finally understood something that had taken him years to learn. Home was never a place. It was the person who stayed when the rest of the world walked away. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was exactly where he belonged.